We have Dr. Melanie Hemenway here today. She works with Nice Chaps, New York State Cattle Health Assurance Program, which is associated with the New York State Department of Ag and Markets. And we're happy to have Melanie here today to present to us. And without further ado, we have Melanie.
Hello, thank you. So I'm going to talk about biosecurity and also some disease concerns that we're seeing around the state. So right off the bat, the question is, what is biosecurity? And if you've been watching the news lately with the coronavirus, you've been seeing a lot of Tyvek and a lot of respirators and gloves and concerns about disease transmission. But when we talk about biosecurity, it goes much further than that. It is a collection of actual management practices that try to put into place to prevent disease from entering onto an operation, and also to minimize the spread or adverse effects of disease if it does make it onto an operation. And when we do look at biosecurity, we are looking at three particular things. So we're looking at it's called the disease triad. So when we do look at diseases and disease outbreaks, we're definitely looking at the disease agents. There are a lot of different, and they act differently. So we want to know, one, what kind of disease does it cause? Does it cause a diarrheal disease or a pneumonia disease? How does it act? How does it get transmitted from one animal to another? How much of a disease does it cause, and how does it exist in the environment? And does it allow it to hide out in the environment? Does it grow in the environment? All of these things is information that makes it beneficial for us to know how to deal with it. The other thing we look at is the environment itself. Does the environment allow that disease agent to hang out and cause more infections? Is it a dirty environment, a clean environment? How well is the ventilation? You can have the greatest ventilation, but that's not going to help you with Johne's disease, for instance. So knowing how the disease acts in the environment can also help with determining what biosecurity practices need to be put in place for particular diseases. And then the last part is we look at the animal itself. What kind of defense does the animal have to combat disease? Does it have a good immune system? Does it have a good plane of nutrition? For calves, we really stress the first few days, did it get that colostrum? Colostrum is very important in developing immunity in a newborn calf to prevent disease. So all of these things interact, and we can have a fantastic, healthy animal that has a great immune system, but if the environment gives the animal a lot of stress, poor cow comfort, or has a buildup of a lot of pathogens in the environment, it can certainly overwhelm that immune system and we have disease. And the same thing, we can have animals that are not as healthy, maybe a little debilitated, and yet they can thrive in a very clean, low pathogen environment. Okay, so why is biosecurity so important? The obvious answer is how it affects animal health directly on your operation. We want to have really healthy animals and minimize disease. Just because it affects your production, it affects your costs in drug costs. The other thing that we're looking at is how it can affect public health. As I mentioned, the coronavirus is linked to wildlife. They think it came from bats. So they think that it got transmitted in a live animal market, and that's how it got into people. So diseases from animals can be a concern for public health and also public perception. If the public sees a lot of sick animals on farms, they think that we're not doing a very good job. So that's why biosecurity is important, to keep our animals as healthy as possible. Even broader than that is foreign animal disease. As a country, we're very concerned about foot and mouth disease for cattle. That is the big kahuna issue, that if it does enter the country, we have very serious concerns. It's a highly contagious, devastating disease to cattle. And if you remember back in the 90s, Great Britain was affected by foot and mouth disease, and they had to destroy an awful lot of cattle. and it was really devastating to their industry. So we do our best as a country to monitor and try to keep foot and mouth disease out of the country. And we do a lot of surveillance. Nobody wants to be the person to disregard an animal that shows signs or possible signs of foot and mouth disease and write it off. And it ends up just spreading like wildfire. And then we have a huge problem. And also there's reemerging and there's endemic diseases. I'm going to talk about Salmonella Dublin. That is a disease that popped up in the late 90s, early 2000s in New York. Then it went away for about 10 years and then it's reemerged now. And it's a definite concern for our New York dairies. And then endemic diseases are just diseases that we see every day that we're constantly trying to minimize their impact. We're also concerned about hidden diseases. There are some diseases are considered the iceberg effect, where we have ones that are visually showing clinical signs of the disease that pop to the surface, and that might indicate that there's more of a problem under the surface that we really visually can't recognize. And Johne's disease is a classic example of that. Because Johne's is a chronic progressive disease that usually infects newborns and young stock at a very early age, but we won't know that those animals are infected until they're much older, years older, like 5 or 6 years or older, before they might show clinical signs. But during that time that they're progressing through their disease, they have the opportunity to spread more Johne's bacteria into the environment and allow more infections, and it just keeps propagating under the surface until we start seeing some pop to the or under the surface, and then we start seeing actual clinical cases above the surface, which is your chronic diarrhea, your weight loss, in the eyes of an animal that has a decent appetite, and the bottle's jaw, which is the last stage. The rule of thumb for Johne's, for every clinical case we visually see, there's probably 15 to 25 animals under the surface that are at varying levels of disease. So that can definitely grow and we wouldn't even know it. BVD is another example. Persistently infected calves can shed a tremendous amount of virus into the environment to allow additional infections to occur. And some BVD PIs are poor doers and they kind of weed themselves out pretty quickly, but some are quite normal looking, happy animals. When we started testing for BVD to be admitted to county and state fairs, we found a substantial number of BVD positives. That there was one beef cow that was champion the previous year. And we found out she was a PI carrier. So she had spread her wealth at her county fair for at least a year or two beforehand. So when we're talking about biosecurity, it's talking about creating a plan that looks at your challenges of disease coming into from outside sources, how it can move around on your farm, and then what you might be sending out of your farm. And then it's identifying best management practices to implement to address those challenges and then actually implementing them. And we would talk about challenges, they're the hazards. Obviously, there's biological hazards, which are your viruses, your bacteria, your parasites, your fungal agents. Those are pretty easy to understand. But we're also talking about chemical hazards. Yeah, anti-inflammatories, pesticides, herbicides, that can have an impact on animal health. And then we have to recognize that there's also on-farm hazards, which can have an impact on biosecurity. I talked about the triad and the environment and the impact on that whole disease outbreak issue. The facilities, the equipment, your animal handling, your treatment methods, all can have a detrimental or a positive effect on disease outbreaks and how well animals can deal with the challenges of disease. And then cow comfort can go a long way as well. So when we talk about introduction of disease, the primary way that farms bring on disease onto their farm is through purchased animals. Expansion herds certainly do suffer through a lot of growing pains when they're bringing in animals from all different sources, a lot of times from other states. So they're exposing their home herd to a lot of different agents. And they can bring in yonis, they bring in BVD, they bring in foot warts, they bring in contagious mastitis, you name it, they've probably been exposed to it. Also, returning animals, that's a second way to bring in some pretty nasty stuff. If you use a calf raiser or if you send your heifers out to a boarding situation and they get commingled with animals from other farms, they're swapping bugs and then they're bringing those bugs back to the home farm. Show animals, everybody knows that if you go to the shows or the fairs that your animals are stressed. A lot of time they get mingled with all of those other animals from other farms. Ventilation may not be the best in the barns, and the chance of your animals getting sick when they come home or bringing home something, that's a real reality. And it's not something that I discourage, it's just you should know the risks and how to protect the animals that you're taking to the show, and also how to protect your home farm from possible disease. And then we also have to consider other ways that disease can get on pests or wildlife. An example would be deer. Deer carry leptosporidia, which they can pass in their urine. So if you pasture your animals and you have deer running through your pastures, you have a potential spread of lepto, and lepto can cause early embryonic deaths and abortions. So you would want to definitely protect your herd through a leptosporidium vaccine. And then feed sources as well. So when we're talking about incoming purchased animals or animals that are returning from a boarding situation or a heifer raiser situation, ideally you don't. You stay a closed herd. That is the best biosecurity you can have. But if you do bring animals in from outside sources, or your animals commingle with animals from outside farms, you want to know where they're coming from. In a perfect situation, it would be a single source farm that you can inspect, that you can do some preliminary testing. You can find out what issues they are having on their farm. Knowing the herd health history can really be a good way to understand what you might be buying in. The other thing is, especially if you don't know the vaccine status of those incoming animals, that you give a primary and secondary vaccine of the animals that are coming in. And also you want to protect your home herd to make sure that your home herd is updated on their vaccinations in order to protect them from what they might be faced from those incoming animals. Years ago when I was in private practice, I went to a beef farm. They had about 25 head, closed herd. They never bothered to vaccinate because they really didn't have any issues on their farm. And then they decided that they were going to buy some heifers, and they bought them from a market. They were really good because they vaccinated those heifers before they got to their farm, but they did nothing to protect their home herd. And they ended up bringing in respiratory virus, which turned into Pasteurella pneumonia. And it took out half of their home herd just because they weren't prepared. They didn't understand what they might be bringing in. So it is definitely a true concern. There are some tests that I would highly recommend if you do purchase animals in from outside sources. BVD is a given. If you buy bulls, cows, heifers, they should all be BVD tested prior to coming in. And that's a common practice in dairy. Beef, I'm not quite sure if that's as well performed in beef herds, but it's a good test. It's an easy test, and yes means that she's a carrier and she needs to be destroyed and not be sent to any farm, because she is a typhoid Mary. She is spreading disease out of every secretion she's out of her body. So you do not want a PI carrier onto your farm. And all your negatives that test negative for BVD carrier status, they're not going to change. It's a lifetime test. It's an accurate test, and it's kind of a no-brainer if you're bringing animals in, because BVD can cause respiratory disease, it can cause diarrhea, and it can cause abortion storms. Another one, if you're purchasing milking animals, looking for contagious mastitis. I see farms that have purchased mycoplasma onto their farm, and that is a long, drawn-out battle to fight mycoplasma mastitis in a herd. So it's a lot easier to prevent it than it is to deal with it later on. Salmonella Dublin is another one. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but that's another disease that you do not want to purchase into your farm. It's really deadly to young stock, huge mortality rates, and Cornell does have an ELISA test that can test pre-purchase to see if they've been exposed and possibly bringing that onto your farm, so you can prevent that. Leukosis is really farm dependent. Just about every farm has leukosis, so it really depends on what your goals are in regards to leukosis. And Johne's disease, there's a lot of issues with the testing. It's not a great test. It doesn't work very well in young animals, so if you're buying heifers, it's a crapshoot whether it's actually going to help you. If it's a positive test, you get to weed out that positive animal, but if they're negative, it does not assure you that they're not infected, because it does miss about half of the infected animals when you're testing. But for Johne's, it would be better to get a herd health history from where those animals are coming from to see if they are doing management, if they're doing testing, so you get an idea of how bad it might be from the source farm. And the other thing is, in the perfect world, you would quarantine any incoming animals for at least 2 weeks away from your home herd. I know that can be difficult, but the farms that have been able to make that work have seen the benefits. They've been able to catch disease before it actually got into their home herd. And bulls, if you only buy an occasional bull, technically you're not a closed herd, because those bulls could be coming in with Salmonella Dublin, with BVD. I guess I wouldn't worry too much with Johne's with bulls, because they are not going to hang around long enough to really contaminate your environment. It's just one animal, and hopefully they wouldn't be going into your maternity pen and exposing your young stock. But you do want to make sure you get virgin males, monitor their fertility. I don't think too many breeding soundness exams occur in New York, but you do want to consider that, if you're depending on a bull for all of your reproduction, then you want to make sure he's doing his job. The other way besides animals is just equipment traffic, vehicles coming onto your farm. If you have hoof trimmers, if you have feed trucks, if you have livestock haulers, you kind of want to minimize their impact on your farm. Try to keep them to an area where it minimizes the chance of them dragging stuff from other farms into your operation. And of course, if you're talking about hoof trimmers and veterinarians and breeders, that they have clean clothes, clean boots, disinfected equipment, so they're not transferring a disease from one farm to another. Feed can be a source. Rodents and bird control, birds can carry salmonellas. Rodents, just because they have the opportunity to defecate in the feed, we want to make sure that there's good control to minimize that. We don't want feed trucks passing through manure and then going to your feed area and contaminating your feed with manure. So we want to take a step back and look at an operation and see if there's what are the opportunities where your feed can get contaminated with manure? Because manure can contain Johne's, it can contain Salmonella, E. coli, Crypto, Coccidia, a whole myriad of issues. If you're feeding animals outside, like for beef operations, ideally you get the feed off the ground. You use these the hay things to prevent them from walking through the feed and getting manure into the feed. And one thing that we saw with Johne's is overages being fed from adult cows to young stock. Especially in free stalls, manure can easily get into the feed and get scooped up and then fed to young stock, and you could be feeding Johne's bugs right to your young. Visitors, the same thing with, like we're talking about the veterinarian and your breeders and your hoof trimmers. Clean clothes, clean boots, restrict their access. We don't want their vehicles or their people walking through manure areas and then into the feed bunks where they could be tracking manure and other things, or bringing stuff from outside or from other farms. So when we do a risk assessment of a farm to determine how things are managed to minimize disease, the maternity pen is the #1 area that we look at, just because we have fresh cows that are stressed from calving, their immune system is stressed, they're not going to be able to fight off disease exposure as well as like a dry cow or an older, a cow that's not stressed. And also you got the newborns, which really don't have a good defense against a whole lot. So of course, not rocket science, we want to see clean and dry. Single use works great if you can manage to clean out the pens and disinfect them between use. If you have packs, those can work very well as long as they're not overcrowded and you can keep them clean and dry. And the test is, can you drop to your knees and keep your knees dry? If they're wet and gross, then the calves are being born in kind of an area that might expose them to some pathogens. Ideally, it's not a hospital pen. We really don't want to see sick cows in your maternity pen, just because those sick cows are shedding whatever, whether it's mastitis or things in their manure or respiratory disease that can get into your fresh cows or your newborns. Separating those two groups. And also a lot of farms are seeing benefits from separating heifers from their cows in their maternity pens, because those heifers do better if they don't compete with the older cows. And then the #2 thing we look at is your neonatal management. And that's all about colostrum, getting good quality, clean colostrum into the newborn as soon as possible. And that means less than 4 to 6 hours after birth. It doesn't necessarily have to be her dam's colostrum, but it should be from a one cow source and not pooled. We don't want to see multiple cows being fed to multiple calves at the same time, just because if one of those cows has an issue and you're feeding it to multiple calves, you're spreading the disease possibility. But if you just do one cow to one calf, you minimize her impact. Colostrum replacement is an excellent resource. And then the other key is removing that calf away from the dam as soon as possible. Let her get licked off, stimulated, and then at minimum move her out of the pen behind a solid-sided barrier or a gate to prevent that calf from getting exposed to adult cow manure. And then the other thing I mentioned before was the products that are leaving the farm, and that's quality milk, making sure that mastitis is kept at a minimum. And it's just basic good management in the parlor, a clean environment. Your cows are coming in clean. You have a milking protocol that is effective for your particular operation, for stripping, for cleaning the teats, for proper stimulation and letdown, and using an effective teat dip. All of those can go a long way to prevent mastitis, and in the end that is helps with your premiums, and it also helps with not using as many antibiotics. And then the other side of it is meat quality or beef quality, and dairies need to remember that they do sell beef. The cull cows are extremely important, and the quality of those cull cows going to market should be an important priority for them. So drug residues is definitely a concern. I'll touch on that in a little bit later. And how you give your injections should follow beef quality assurance. And when those cull cows leave your farm, you should look at them and decide if you would actually feed your family that cow. Thing on vaccination. Vaccinations can be extremely useful, but it does not equal a biosecurity plan because of so many other factors. You want to make sure that you're vaccinating for the particular diseases that are of concern for your particular operation. And also that you're timing the vaccinations for best protection. There's a lot of over-vaccinating out there. Seems like every time they turn around, they're sticking the cows with something. You can actually over-vaccinate, where you're actually stressing that system of the animal, and you're actually depleting her resources instead of boostering them. So knowing what vaccines you need and when to give them is really, you should be working with your veterinarian on a good plan for your particular operation. And you should revisit that plan at least once a year because things change. You don't want to get addicted to certain things that you possibly could do without. Or there's new challenges coming down, or maybe your operation has changed, you've purchased something in, so you want to recognize any new challenges that you want to get ahead of. And also how you give your vaccines. You shouldn't assume that everybody knows how to give an injection properly. So employee training, making sure that they know how to give a sub-Q injection versus an IM injection and where they should be giving it. You should never assume that people just know how to do that. And remember that you can vaccinate every 2 weeks, but if the conditions, the environment is a challenging environment, it can still overwhelm the best immune system. So it is a total package. You need to look at the whole deal. And I mentioned employee training. If your farm does have employees, communication is really key to create responsibility with your employees, to let them understand why they're doing what you're asking them to do, what biosecurity is, how disease is transmitted. And this is to help your animals, but also to prevent issues with your employees as well. And livestock handling and animal welfare go a long way towards animal comfort. All of your employees should be trained on how to efficiently and quietly handle animals to reduce that stress level. And there's a lot of resources out there that are available. Animal Care 365 has some wonderful videos for training your employees. And if you're part of a co-op that uses the National Milk Farm Program, they really encourage, or they require you to have written standard operating procedures and employee training on how to handle cattle. I just want to mention our Nice Chat program. It is a program that's been around since 1998, and the basis of the program is all about biosecurity and best management practices, and it can certainly help a farm evaluate what their challenges are, discuss concerns, bring your veterinarian into the picture, and create a team to help identify issues and create a plan. And then spinning off of that, we have specific modules that, depending on the farm, what it addresses specifically. Like if a farm is concerned about Johne's disease, we have a module that's more detailed in how to deal with that, what tests are available, how best to create a testing strategy, what kind of management is necessary, what are realistic goals, and what are some good things that the farm can implement. And we have an excellent one on lameness that looks at everything regarding lameness. If you're expanding, heightened biosecurity issues that you can look at, Salmonella, BVD, leukosis. Our latest one, which isn't on here, is our food safety drug residue avoidance module, which can be very helpful in that whole quagmire of drug usage. So it is an integrative disease prevention program, and it's all about increasing your herd health, the productivity of your animals, and your profitability. It is a state-sponsored program. It's voluntary. It is a free program to producers. It is confidential. We will pay your herd veterinarian to participate in the on-farm review. So it would be the NYS veterinarian, which is typically a state veterinarian, or a private vet that is certified. With your herd veterinarian, the farm itself, and anybody else the farm wants to bring along, employees or managers or consultants. And we do a walkthrough of the farm. We talk about concerns. We look at goals, we look at issues, and what we create is a herd plan. Like I said, it's strategies that the farm can implement within their current resources to make improvements. I will move to just some specific diseases that we're seeing around the state. Salmonella Dublin is something that we've seen kind of explode in New York State. It actually is a disease that was thought to be west of the Mississippi and was not in the Northeast for years and years. But in 1988 through 1995, there was a smattering of outbreaks in New York and Pennsylvania. And then in 1995, it just kind of disappeared. But then it came back in 2006. And the interesting thing about that is when it came back, they found that it had grown resistance to some antibiotics. So currently, Salmonella Dublin has grown to be a very resistant bug to our defenses with antibiotics. So that is a definite case of showing that resistance is a real thing, and we have seen that locally. So since 2006, we are seeing more and more outbreaks. It started out as different pockets around the state, but now it's getting to be more and more widespread just through animal traffic. So Salmonella Dublin is not a typical expression that you usually think of when you think of salmonellas. Usually you think of diarrhea and enteric disease, but this is a bacterial infection that causes severe respiratory disease in young animals. And they can be anywhere from newborns to older, like 6 months of age. It really depends on the exposure that they received, typically in the calving pen, or maybe through traffic into the calf barn or calf area, and also stress levels. So a lot of times we'll see them be fine in hutches, but as soon as they get moved into a group situation, we have an outbreak. And in group situation, where they start out in groups, we will see sporadic outbreaks, usually dependent on season or seasonal issues. It shows up as high fevers, as high as 107. Again, it's a respiratory disease, so a lot of times it gets misdiagnosed for the first time as a mycoplasma or a pasturella or a viral pneumonia. But these animals are extremely sick. There's high death losses, and you will find that they do not respond to the normal treatments that you use. So those are your first key signs that it might be Salmonella Dublin. The picture shows at the bottom a healthy lung. It's nice and pink. It's dry looking. It's springy. It's soft. And then the other picture is a Salmonella Dublin lung. So it just pretty much overwhelms the lungs. They become really condensed and solid and firm and moist. And the animal becomes septic. That bacterial infection quickly spreads to the blood and just overwhelms the animal. Normally, it's young animals. We rarely see clinical disease in the adults. The ones that we have seen, it's typical. They have a high temperature. They're septic. It looks like a hot mastitis cow, but without the mastitis. And we do see abortion storms with this. A lot of times it's in heifers that first get exposed to the disease and they'll abort. It is transmitted through nose to nose, and it can get aerosolized. So farms that do have this issue should really take care about using pressure washers, because it can actually throw it up into the air. And people can get infected with Salmonella Dublin, so we want to make sure that people do protect themselves with gloves, proper hygiene when they're experiencing an outbreak. And this is really a challenge for group housing because of that nose-to-nose transmission, because it gets aerosolized. In group housing, you have all of that, and you have the shared nipples, so it can really run rampant in the group housing situation. There is a risk assessment that works very well if a farm is interested to look at what kind of risks are they doing now that might bring it onto the farm or allow it to perpetuate on the farm. It's available on the NYS Dept website. It just asks you a series of questions, grades your questions, and then it will give you a readout of particular areas where your weak links are. I mentioned the ELISA test through Cornell. It was a test that they brought in from Denmark, specifically because of the concerns of Salmonella dublin. And it works on milk and blood. It does give you the idea if an animal's been exposed to Salmonella dublin, it'll have antibodies that will be reflected in the ELISA. If you use it as a screening test to see if your farm has it on your farm, one negative test isn't enough. It's only a 30% effective if you just do one bulk tank. You really need to do quarterly bulk tanks, and after 4, the confidence level gets up to 90%. But if you're a herd that's consistently bringing animals in, or heifer raisers, it's a really challenge with heifer raisers because of all the different sources that are coming into their farm. Then you probably need to continually screen for that to make sure that it's not coming in. A lot of times with farms that have experienced this, they experience the outbreak, and when we do the bulk tank test, it doesn't show up because it usually hits the young stock first, and it hits them hard. And then usually because, say, a heifer was brought in from a heifer raiser, goes through the calving pen, seeds it with bacterial Salmonella dublin, causes the outbreak, and then she goes through the herd. And it takes a while for that herd to get exposed to the bacteria and start creating antibodies, which will then trigger a bulk tank. And it's really farm dependent. The bigger the farm, the longer it takes for that bulk tank to show up as positive. So testing high-risk groups like your sick cow group or your fresh cow group can give you a better idea sooner than the bulk tank. If the best way is purchasing animals in or using the heifer raisers, so having that conversation with your heifer raiser, I think, is a critical conversation, even though it's an uncomfortable conversation a lot of times. But just determine what kind of protocols that heifer raiser is put into place to protect your animals and protect you from bringing that onto your home farm. And you have to accept some of the risk as well when you do use a heifer raiser or a calf raiser. The test, if you do purchase animals in, you can use that ELISA test, ideally to test the source farm to see if they have exposure to it, or you can test the individual animals that are coming into your farm. And then if you do end up with it on your farm, the single most important thing you can do is to protect that most susceptible population, which is your newborns and your young calves. And most of the time they're picking up in the calving pen, because in active outbreaks, a lot of times when that farm goes through and strips their maternity pen, cleans and disinfects it, I'm talking about work on, they can actually stop the outbreak. So the sooner you recognize an outbreak, the sooner you need to implement management practices to minimize that. And the other thing you can do is remove those sick calves out of the group to prevent more infections from occurring, especially if it's a group housing situation. There's not much recommendation to use that ELISA test as a test call. It's just not feasible. Some of those animals that recover from the disease can become carriers, and it's not sure as to how long they can stay carriers. We've seen them be carriers for a month up to 6 months. And eventually they'll seroconvert and they'll be fine. But during that carrier status, they can be putting more into the environment. But it's more of having a management to to live with the disease. I've seen any farms in New York actually get totally rid of it. It's more of mitigating the disease issue problems on the farm. The other thing that we've seen around the state on the last few years, these really ugly strains of pinkeye, and some herds have purchased this in from other areas. The commercial vaccine isn't even offering any protection with these pinkeye, and these farms are experiencing pinkeye year round. It's not just during the summer months. Newport Labs, for example, will actually take swabs of pinkeye disease from that farm and then create a specific vaccine to address what they have. A lot of farms have had good success with that. But then there's also management, reducing dust, fly control in the summer. But that's something that I know a beef farm purchased it in a few years ago. So you should be thinking about all of that when you bring animals in. And then even though this isn't a disease, it is definitely a concern regarding drug usage. I mentioned antibiotic resistance. There's a lot of finger pointing towards animal agriculture and saying that we overuse and abuse drugs, and that's leading to a lot of resistance. I don't think that's particularly accurate, but we do use a lot of drugs that are used in human medicine, and we need to be part of the conversation and be responsible. We are regulated through AMDUCA, which is the American Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act, which talks about how we're supposed to be using prescription drugs, having a veterinarian relationship, and following prohibited drugs, restricting certain drugs on how we use them. It is regulated by the FDA and also USDA. Most of you are probably familiar with the new veterinary feed directive that went into effect a couple of years ago, where you could no longer purchase the tetracycline crumbles or the feed additives, the antibiotic additives over the counter. You can't buy them from the feed mill. You have to now go through your veterinarian to use them, and you have to use them per label. It's a lot more restricted. Well, they had great success with that. In fact, tetracycline sales and tetracycline use in agriculture went down dramatically. And residue violations in bull calves for neomycin, which was a common antibiotic used in milk replacers, dropped tremendously. We only see very few now. So for FDA standpoint, that was a huge success. Their next plan is to move all of the antibiotics that are currently over the counter, like penicillin, LA200, things that you can go into Tractor Supply and buy, move those to prescription status. So eventually in the next few years, you're going to have to go through a veterinarian to purchase antibiotics, medically important antibiotics. And that means that you have to have that VCPR, that relationship with a veterinarian. There's a lot of emphasis on that drug usage, treatment records. All of this is to prevent drug residue violations. And for New York State, we have stayed steady for the past few years at 50 residue violations in animals and meat. The USDA tests a substantial number of cull animals and beef animals, all food animals, through the markets. And for New York, like I said, it usually stays around 50 violations. So we have not shown much improvement in drug residues and their violations. What's really concerning, in 2018, we had 51 residue violations in meat, 100% of those coming from the culled dairy cow sector. Very few of those 51 were from bull calves. Most of them were from dairy cull cows. And the other concerning thing is the ceftiofur drug family, which is Naxel, Xanel, Exceed, and the generic, I think it's Ceftioflex, is now half of those drug residues. So those drugs are either they're being used more and it's moving into that tetracycline sector, and that's why it's taking up half of those residue violations, or there's misuse or something's going on that's creating violations from these drugs. I think there's a lot of confusion about these drugs. So if you do use these, I would highly recommend that you talk to your veterinarian to make sure you're using them properly. They are prohibited drugs where you cannot use them extra label. So you should be very familiar what's on the label and what's on the drug insert. Because you really don't want to be on that violation list that the USDA and FDA puts out, because then you're kind of a branded farm having a violation. We do have a program to help farms at this point. This is our drug residue avoidance education program, which particularly addresses drug use and management. It's a free, voluntary, confidential program, very similar to Nice Chap, where we will pay your herd veterinarian to come out, do a review on your farm, look at your drug use protocols, look at your treatment records, making sure that that you're using the drugs properly, that you're not going to get yourself into trouble, and look for other opportunities to reduce your drug usage. And that's a good thing because it would save you money. So this is a voluntary program, but we do a one-time visit with the state vet, your herd vet, and the farm. And then after that, we will continue to pay your herd vet to do follow-up visits. And that'll also help you establish a VCPR and maintain your VCPR for the next few years, as long as we can maintain this program. And also it'll help you meet your farm, your cooperative farm program needs, which is they want you to have treatment protocols. They want your vet to sign off on your drug usage. So this will help pay for that. If you have any questions about either Nice Chap or the disease biosecurity, any of this, or the drug residue program, here's my contact information. So I guess if there's any questions.
Thank you, Melanie, for a great presentation. Okay, are there any known wildlife reservoirs for Salmonella Dublin?
Not that I'm aware of, and it has never been linked to wildlife creating Salmonella Dublin issues. It's more of a bovine thing, and because it's nose to nose and aerosolized, I think the contact would have to be more direct. I think that would be, I mean, I'm not saying that it's not possible, but it would be more likely coming from maternity pen area or the interaction of your calves with each other.
Great. Let's see, I have a question. You mentioned the ELISA test for Salmonella Dublin in the bulk tank. Do you know what the cost would be associated with those tests?
Yeah, they're around $15 a sample. So it's really not a costly test at all. And yeah, it's definitely well worth it. And if you're using it as a screening for purchased animals, I would recommend doing a 2 sample 2 weeks apart, 1 sample every 2 weeks, because if that animal, say, got exposed the day that you're doing your first sample, it'll take a couple of weeks for her to mount antibodies and find it, just to assure that that animal, you're not bringing something that's been recently exposed and might be shedding the infection.
Can you please explain how vaccinations may or may not result in a false positive for Salmonella Dublin in the bulk tank?
So there is a vaccine for Salmonella Dublin, Entrovine, I believe it's called. And it can muddy the waters with ELISA. It depends on how you give it. Typically it's given to calves. And if you give it per label, which is an IM or sub-Q injection, it's a very harsh vaccine. In fact, it causes a lot of reactions and you can actually lose calves from the vaccine itself. But it can create a false positive on the ELISA test. A lot of farms have decided to minimize the impact of the vaccine on the reactions and give it orally, which there's question whether that actually builds a titer, because when Cornell did some testing they found that the animal's titer was 0. So if it didn't mount a titer, if it's given orally, it really wonders whether it actually works that way. But empirically, some farms thinks that it work. Personally, I think because you see Salmonella outbreaks kind of ebb and flow, it might have been on its way out anyway when they decided to vaccinate. So the vaccine gets the credit, but it might have been actually management changes that made the difference.
What's the best way for farmers to stay up to date on when they might not be able to purchase those over-the-counter antibiotics?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. The FDA has been saying that they've been going to target those over-the-counter drugs for the last few years as part of their 5-year plan, but every year they say it's part of their 5-year plan. I would say that, of course, administration issues and political issues too might play a role, but it is something that they have talked about for a while. And because they've seen so much success with what the VFD and removing those products from over the counter, I would guess that it's definitely within the next 3 years. But they play their cards really tight to their chest. They don't give out much information about what their plans are. So it's really tough to give any definitive answers when it comes to the FDA.
And you mentioned an increase in, or a constant, a consistency in the drug residues that we're having, not a decrease. Are those residues found from multiple farms, or is it usually repeat offenders?
So most of them are from separate farms. There's a few farms that have multiple residues, and they're considered repeat violators if those residues occur within a 12-month span of each other. And then they go on the repeat residue violator list, which gets published on the website for FDA and USDA. And then they have issues with their cull cow markets because now they're branded that they might sell tainted animals. Fortunately, that number is pretty minimal. I think there's only maybe 1 or 2 repeat violators at this time for New York State.
That's good.
But a lot of times and a lot of times the residues are caused from just human error, honest mistakes, not writing the right number of the animal down that was treated, or poor communication with who gave the treatment and who's making the culling decisions. Things that can easily be improved through management, communication, protocols, tightening up procedures to prevent mistakes like that from happening.
If you do have any other questions, feel free to email Melanie. You can see her email address here, or reach out to any of your extension specialists and we'll be able to connect you to Melanie or get the answer for you. So with that, thank you all for joining us today in our webinar and hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you.